Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, the season couldn't have gotten off to a worse start. Joe and I break it all down, from the offense to the pitching, and of course, the bad blood with Rhys Hoskins. As always, we close out the show answering your mailbag questions because we're here for you. So subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today and be sure to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, drop us a question with that review. Watch us on YouTube. Drop us questions in the YouTube comment section right under the show. We're always looking for mailbag questions all over the internet, including the classic Twitter spots when Joe sends his tweet at PSL to Flushing. All right, I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. Joe, let's be honest, bad start to the season. The Mets dropped their first 4 games all at Citi Field, and it's not just that they lost all 4, but I think the way, in a variety of ways, they've lost these 4 games, Joe. Before we even get into the very, very specifics, just your thoughts how this season has started.
Not ideal. I think that's a good way to put it. I think there's kind of 2 discussions right now, right? Where it's one, and we're going to get into the details of what has not gone well. But I also think this doesn't necessarily need to derive into a big picture, huge Mets issue type of discussion, and that this is like what's going to be for the season. With that said, I certainly understand like the angst that fans feel. And when you entered this season, fans were not happy with the way that the offseason went. They did not like the players that they added. They didn't think the Mets were aggressive enough. And, at being 0-4, it's one of those things where fans can be like, I told you this wasn't the right mix of players. So it's been, obviously a tough few days, but we'll get into some details here as the first 4 games and kind of forge the path ahead.
I think the very surface level of it is this is a franchise right now that did not have the trust of the fan base going into the year. And that leaves you no opportunity, no breathing room to get off to a slow start because the fans are already understandably pessimistic, not hopeful, and setting the bar really low and still performing under the bar kind of brings that feeling of dread. And I think that the Mets were a colossal disappointment last year, and they did not change much of this roster. A lot of the changes that have been made of this roster were made at the deadline last year, and those guys, while a lot of them underperformed, not all of them, guys like Tommy Pham were moved. He's somebody that overperformed, say, with David Robertson. But Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander, as much as they underperformed, were still effective pitchers in terms of compared to what else the Mets have on the back end in the middle of this rotation. And I think that's probably a lot of the frustration with the fans is that this was an offseason that we hadn't seen in the Steve Cohen era. Until especially, really their biggest move came at the end of spring training with signing JD Martinez, who's not even ready to play right now. So I think that's why the reaction to this is there's 2 sides of the coin, right, Joe? There's the side that I think you and I, for a lot of this show, will lean on is that it's 4 games in a baseball season that is very, very long. But I think it's fair that the other side of it, and we're going to get into all the specifics, is all the things you fear or worry about or doubt felt so magnified across 4 games into the season. And, the Brewers have been a good team for a long time. The Tigers are an up-and-coming team. I actually picked them to win the division in the SNY prediction. I think the Tigers are being slept on. But it's not the Braves. It's not the Astros. It's not the Dodgers. It's not the Yankees. It's not the Orioles. To look uncompetitive for 3 of the 4 games is extremely, extremely problematic. So, and like I said, we'll break it down group by group. I think we start with the pitching because we always do as the rotation turns, where we actually have a positive because Sean Manaea looked great through almost 6 innings. Truly great. The stuff was real. He looked confident. He looked in control for much of it. And I think on the flip side of it, Joe, Severino, who ran into some bad luck and also had some problems of his own, and Tyler McGill, who's now already dealing with an IL stint, was very much the same Tyler McGill in the problematic side of throwing too many pitches, not pitching deep into the game. This is exactly what the concerns were. The Mets are facing a situation, and while we haven't seen Adrian Hauser pitch as we record this, Kodai Senga is not back with the team yet. The young guys haven't come up. The reality is, even if Sean Manaea is a really nice story this year, the Mets need more than that. They're going to need more than that, especially with Senga out for the beginning of this season. So, I mean, it just feels like, yes, it's 4 games, but you can kind of see a lot of the fears of this rotation, and that's without us even getting to the offense yet, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, look, when we were going into the season, that was the concern of the team. Like, we did our hot, lukewarm, and cold segment last week, and, as much as the lineup hasn't performed, we feel pretty good about what that will likely be throughout the course of 162. I think, all in all, the bullpen has done a pretty fine job. Like, it's not been complete shutdown, but the bullpen hasn't exactly just gotten shellacked every reliever that has walked in. The rotation is the one that we walked in, and I think I said lukewarm and you said cold. And, Jose Quintana on opening day, that man looked cold, physically cold, because it was cold on opening day when I was there. And he was, he just didn't have his usual command and control, but he's the kind of guy that, I think he's going to be just fine. He's going to get into a rhythm, and I think you kind of know what Jose Quintana is. It was not a good start for Luis Severino. And yeah, at the beginning, when you had Zach Short kind of boot that ground ball, that sort of set some things in motion that kind of, waterfalled his start a bit. But Severino wasn't locating his pitches well. When he was throwing strikes, he was throwing bad strikes. And that was one of the things in spring training. Luis Severino was locating his stuff where it needed to be, and he was very effective. The Severino that we saw in Game 2 of this season looked just like the Luis Severino that posted a 6 ERA for the Yankees last year. With that said, I do think, obviously, I sure hope better days are ahead for Luis Severino, because that would be not ideal if this was just what he was going to be each time out. But his stuff was, velocity was there. That wasn't a problem. But the location of his stuff is paramount, and he just wasn't locating well. So all in all, when you look at this rotation, it was a mixed bag. You had Quintana just kind of okay, almost battled through 5. Tyler McGill kind of looking like Tyler McGill. Luis Severino, unfortunately, looking like 2023 Severino for one start. And Sean Manaea was obviously fantastic. So mixed bag, and we'll see what Adrian Hauser gives next.
Right, and I think the story of the bullpen is almost what we expected. The story isn't the bullpen, and I don't think the story necessarily is the starting pitching. While neither have been spectacular, we think when the Mets get the ball with a lead, which they haven't had, to Edwin Diaz, Brooks Raley, Jake Diekman, that caliber of reliever, the Mets are going to be fine. It's figuring out who out of Tonkin, Lopez, and Drew Smith, who's been the best out of those 3, are going to be the guys to be that bridge. And it's a trickle effect. If the Mets are not getting more than 4 to 5 innings from the Severinos, Quintanas, McGills, it doesn't matter. Because the Mets, not a lot of teams in baseball have a bullpen that's going to be spotless from the 5th inning and on, right? I mean, that's just not a way to live. You could do it once every 5th game or whatever it may be. But when 3 out of your 5 starters or 4 out of your 5 starters are saying, well, it's the 5th or 6th inning, it's time for the bullpen, you can't live that way. Teams are not constructed to be that spotless across the bullpen. So I think directing the anger at, Jorge Lopez or Michael Tonkin, or eventually it's going to be directed at Drew Smith when he gives up a run, it feels almost misplaced right now. the Mets have an infrastructure problem in their rotation. And this isn't me reacting to 4 games. This is me reacting to what the problem has been with the Mets now for a while. You can go all the way back across last year. Not being able to pitch deep into games almost ever, right? And credit to Manaea for being a guy that did give them, the 6 innings and the rare quality start that they have. And, but once again, that's one guy. So that brings us to, I think, the biggest issue amongst all, and that has to be the offense right now. And Joe, I can't believe we're sitting here and this is the discussion. The reality is the bottom of the lineup is not the issue. Francisco Alvarez off to a really hot start. Brett Beatty's been fine. Listen to the numbers in the 1 through 5 hole right now. The leadoff man, which is always Nimmo right now, right? 1 for 16 with a walk. Batting second, which is typically Francisco Lindor right now. 1 for 16 with 2 walks. Batting third, which has been Alonso, has been fine. He's hit the home run. He's been fine. Not great, but fine. Fourth, which is a huge problem with this team right now, and we knew that until JD Martinez gets here. We've seen plenty of McNeil. 1 for 16 with no walks. All 3 of those spots, 1, 2, and 4, have a batting average of .063 and an on-base percentage well below 200. You can't win baseball games that way. You cannot win baseball games that way. And this isn't the Mets where they're turning a new leaf and they got, Luis Angel Acuna and Jett Williams and Drew Gilbert up there, and they're trying to give these guys room to grow. These are guys that, yes, it's 4 games, but they got to perform. They have to perform. All of them getting off to this kind of start across from Nimmo, Lindor, McNeil. The Mets will not hang around for the playoff race if these guys are non-factors right now. And I'll be honest with you, Joe, I don't think JD Martinez magically fixes all of that. If the Mets are getting nothing out of 2 of the top 4 spots at the top of the lineup, it just won't matter at all. And that's where you start to wonder, when are they going to start to lean on Alvarez, who looks ready for stardom, at the point where some hard decisions are made? And this will be a later summer conversation, but when those younger guys get here, are they going to get chances to be run producers at the top of the lineup, where if they get on... I love Brandon Nimmo. I really do. But you do have to wonder with Nimmo, his lack of base stealing ability in this era of baseball. And when you watch the Brewers series, it really becomes very amplified. The Mets need somebody at the top of the lineup that when they get on base, it just drives the pitcher insane. And they can get to second base or they can get to third base. They can get from second to home. And I think that reality is facing us a lot quicker than people want to admit.
Look, Brandon Nimmo and Francisco Lindor, they're going to hit. I don't think I certainly understand what you're saying and get it. But at the same time, Brandon Nimmo and Francisco Lindor are very low on my worry meter, per se. Like, it's bad that they are bad right now. And this is very high-level baseball analysis. When your best players aren't good, you're not going to be good.
Right.
Very high level there. But when you look at, Nimmo, Lindor, I think some of the problems is the at-bats at times don't look competitive.
That's my issue.
I think that's a fair thing to say. But I can't sit here and really think Brandon Nimmo and Francisco Lindor are going to be a problem for an extended period of time. And maybe I am way too glass half full on that, but I think those guys are going to hit and they're going to be, frankly, just fine. I'm not sure on Jeff McNeil. That's a bit of a question mark that we have here. I mean, he had that poor first half last year, had a closer to normal Jeff McNeil second half, not quite batting title good, but I think he hit over 280. On base percentage was kind of like back in a normal area for him. But he is a player that, when you look at his game offensively, if he's not hitting 290 plus, he is not a value add to an offense, because he's not an extra base hit threat. He's not obviously a home run threat. He's not a stolen base threat. So McNeil really just needs to hit for average. It's a lot like, Luis Ariz on Miami. If he's not hitting for average, he ain't doing anything for you. So Jeff McNeil certainly needs to get rolling. And I hate to go on DJ Stewart, but I had said this on air. I said this off air. Mark Vientos should have made this baseball team and gotten the opportunity to DH, even if it was temporarily, over DJ Stewart. While, yes, you want Mark Vientos getting every day at bats, you want him getting work at third base, but much like the conversation that we had over text message about Francisco Alvarez, DHing when he's off in the early going until JD Martinez is back. While that's not a season-long thing where every time Alvarez is off, he needs to find a way to get into the lineup as a DH, Mark Vientos should be on this team and should be getting opportunities. And of course, he's hitting in Syracuse because he was going to hit in Syracuse. But DJ Stewart, to me, he should be in AAA Syracuse. The bats that he has, when he comes up, gives me the feeling as a fan, a strikeout is coming. Like, just right or wrong, that's how I kind of take a DJ Stewart at bat. So I think the Mets.
You've been right. 4 of 7 at bats. So,
but
for what it's
but
worth.
I do think the Mets may have missed the boat on that. And I had said this on the show last week that I thought Vientos should have been on the team. But all things considered, the offense has not really performed. Starling Marte looks good. I'll give him that. Offensively, I'd like to see him utilizing his legs on the bases because he is that stolen base threat that you were just talking about, Connor. Alvarez looks locked in. Beatty, I like what I'm seeing from him. He's hitting the ball hard. He had the home run off Hobie Milner, the lefty, which Hobie Milner does not give up home runs to lefties. And you're seeing him elevate the ball with velocity. So I feel okay about where Beatty is at. But all in all, the reality is 4 games have gone by, and the Mets haven't really scored runs in 3 of them.
We'll get to down on the farm, what Syracuse is up to in a bit, because they might be knocking on that door, calling that team real soon. But that's really, I think, Joe, going back to the Nimmo, Lindor, McNeil point, because you're right. I'm not sitting here going, like, we're doomed. These guys it's over for them. They fell off a cliff. Especially Nimmo and Lindor. They are really good players, and every Mets fan, I think for the most part, is pretty happy they're here. I think the point of it, Joe, is that this team isn't good enough for those guys to slump. And that's a scary thought because all great players slump. And I think Nimmo's a good player. I think Lindor is a really good player. I don't know if the Mets in their lineup, besides Pete for the most part, for the kind of hitter he is, have a great player. And when I say great player, I'm talking about the Harper, Acuna, right? Freddie Freeman, Mookie Betts. The Mets have good players, and I think for Lindor, for the most part, a really good player. And those guys are going to slump, and the Mets, it seems like, don't have the pitching or the pop on the back end of the lineup to overcome those times. And this was the first 4 games of the season that had happened, so it felt even worse, right? They will get hot, they will score runs, they will win games. But yeah, that's the frustrating part of it all, is that this team's not good enough to overcome that. Because even when you look back at 2022, when they won all of those games, Marte was amazing for that team. The Mets got run production from other areas a lot. And we don't know if that team has that yet this year. We'll see if Marte can keep this up. He's been the best hitter on the team besides Alvarez through the first 4 games. Like you said, you like the confidence that Beatty has shown off as well. And the reality is the guys that are on this bench are here for their defense in Tyrone Taylor, Joey Wendell, and Zach Short. And I think it was a tough one out of the gate for sure.
Joey Wendell for sure. But by the way, I thought Tyrone Taylor's had some good at bats.
I like Tyrone Taylor.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with him, but we could talk about Joey. We could certainly talk about Joey Wendell if you want to.
Well, yeah, I think with Wendell, the issue is because I don't feel this way about Short. I think Zach Short gets this reputation as he's only here for his glove. Zach Short hit in the spring, and he's had competitive at-bats. He's only had 3 plate appearances, but at least he has a hit and hasn't struck out. Wendell, I don't think is a competitive hitter anymore. So if he's not a plus defender, and he doesn't even look like an average defender in the little bit we've seen of him, I don't know why he's on this roster. And that you got time to change it, but you don't got a lot of time. Because there are a lot of guys in Syracuse that are going to be knocking on the door, and he's going to be one of the first guys that you're looking at and going, well, if you're only a defensive replacement that isn't very good at, as a defensive replacement, we're going to get other people up here So I think that's going to be an interesting talking point around Wendell. Let's get to Hoskins before we totally move on, because we haven't talked about this. There's a lot to unpack, of course, here with Hoskins. I think at the very forefront of it, Joe, I'll just say this. I thought the slide was garbage, and Hoskins is a guy that has a reputation for that. I thought it was actually just as pathetic that when McNeil gets in his face, Hoskins turns his head and runs into the dugout and then decides to talk from the dugout. Credit to Rhys Hoskins, because when he got up to the plate the next day, he killed the Mets. There's no denying that the guy absolutely stuck it to them with the hitting. But the absolute catalyst of all of this was not that Jeff McNeil started with Rhys Hoskins and Hoskins got payback. It's a bad slide. And if I was McNeil, almost having, I mean, you're talking about potential season ending injury if his knee twists a little bit the other way. I would be just as mad. If you're Hoskins and you want to put your head down and you don't want the conflict, that's fine. There's no problem with that. Don't reignite the conflict from the dugout after the situation. So I get why the Mets are being laughed at by this, because I don't think the Mets handled this well at all, to be quite honest with you. And this has been a problem for the Mets, whether they've been getting hit a lot by pitches and not responding the right way over the last year under Buck Showalter. This is not how you wanted the season to start this year. But I think at the end of the day, I do want to open with it that it's a really bad play by Hoskins, and McNeil being angry by it is justified for that way. It's disappointing how the Mets responded the next 2 days.
So the slide was a late slide, and that to me by nature is a bad play, and I think Rhys Hoskins has to deep down know that by the letter of the law, he followed the rules because he stayed on the base. But like you said, Jeff McNeil, you saw him go right into that shin knee area. You saw it kind of go back just a little bit. It could have been disastrous. We've seen that here. Obviously, the slide from Chase Utley is not exactly comparable to what Hoskins did, but McNeil could have been hurt really badly. And honestly, I thought we were going to get more out of McNeil in that moment than we did, than the pointing. I thought McNeil was ready to go. And
Hoskins didn't respond.
Yeah.
He did not look at him.
Yeah. Hoskins got up, ran away. And like you said, I think that looks soft on his part, right? If you're going to do the crying thing, and then you're going to talk
always
after
in the dugout.
Game.
Always in the dugout.
In the dugout behind 100 people. And I mean, Hoskins just real cheap stuff and wasn't a fan. As far as the Mets handling of it, the right thing to do, or I don't even want to say right, because it's not like you want to sit here and say throw at people. But if you're going to throw at Rhys Hoskins, the time to throw at him was his next at bat on that day.
Right.
And there was a lot of discussion, Ron Darling and Todd Zeal, who certainly know baseball and the unwritten rules of baseball a hell of a lot more than I ever will. I did not agree with them that they're like, on the next day, you had to throw at him in his first at bat. People, you saw Yohan Ramirez get ejected and subsequently suspended. Do you think Luis Severino would not have gotten ejected if he threw at him at the beginning of the next day? Of course he would have. And then how do you, of course, we have the hindsight, right? Luis Severino had a bad day. So I certainly saw you all in my Twitter mentions that it would have been fine if Severino got ejected because he pitched poorly. But we're looking at this in hindsight now of we know what happened. In the moment, you can't lose your starter in the first inning just to kind of prove a point, and then your bullpen's ruined for that day and the next day. And then Severino's potentially suspended on top of it. With that said, it doesn't obviously look great when you throw at him after he kicks the crap out of you, right? Like that's optically, that looks kind of weak. But, good for Yohan Ramirez. If, this is something that last year we had talked about on this show and certainly has been talked about all over media, that the Mets would constantly get thrown at and nobody would do anything. And, good on Yohan Ramirez for going out and at least throwing in a direction of Hoskins. I would have preferred if it was a little lower. We really, as much as the play wasn't good by Hoskins, we don't want to get into a point where we're head hunting. That's not cool. But someone had to do something, and I think it was kind of a lose-lose for the Mets. There was,
I agree.
Once they didn't do it the day of the slide, there wasn't a winning scenario to me.
That's the issue. The winning scenario for the Mets there at that point, right, when it got to that point, is come back and win the game, which they almost did, and then win the next day. And they didn't win either game. And the bottom line is, I mean, it comes down to two things, honestly. And I want to be fair to McNeil because, once again, I beg people to watch after the slide. Hoskins puts his head down away from McNeil and runs into the dugout. If you're McNeil and you don't want to do this because you don't want to get suspended, he basically has to fight him right there if he wants any shot at him. And
Yeah.
there's not a lot of guys in baseball that obviously want to do that because you're jeopardizing the team when you get suspended if you're a key part of the team. So there's risk to that. Not that Hoskins had any interest in entertaining any conflict with McNeil. And then, like you said, Joe, it becomes really convoluted because the issue of if you lose your starting pitcher, who's supposed to be a frontline starter for this team at the beginning of the game, well, that's going to put everyone in a predicament for the rest of the series.
And Michael Tonkin threw 2 innings the day before, so there's your long reliever. He had already been used in long relief the day before.
It's really, really tricky, and I get everybody that, because I feel your pain. The response by the Mets was just, it's not good enough. And I think I also want to be fair, the root of the play, I just am floored by the celebratory nature of Hoskins. Who cares about like the Brewers Twitter, but just in general, missing the root of the problem. If that slide happens to, I mean, name any star in baseball, Mookie Betts, and he's out for 4 months, what is the reaction? I mean, once again, an extra 6 inches of a star or a delay into McNeil. McNeil's knee is done for the season. So I think the Mets are justifiably angry. And I think that it's just frustrating they didn't respond the right way. So that'll be that with Hoskins. Until further notice, we'll see.
Last series of the season is when we see Milwaukee again. So we start
really
the season with Milwaukee and end with Milwaukee. And it may or may not be interesting, to your point. It kind of depends how the next few months go. But I think the whole Hoskins situation will certainly bear watching as we go ahead 6 months from now.
It feels like the Brewers will be hanging around for some kind of playoff contention. Hopefully we could say the same about the Mets at that point of the year. There's way too much baseball left. So we will see if it matters, and we'll see if Hoskins can actually make it through the season as well. That's something that obviously he hasn't been able to do. So you're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast. Let's go down on the farm, Joe. Some early thoughts from Syracuse. We saw right out of the gate both Luis Angel Acuna and Drew Gilbert hitting home runs. They have not been hitting a ton through 3 games, but both those guys with home runs to start. Of course, Vientos already has a home run because, of course. But some early thoughts from Syracuse, Joe, where the Mets will probably get some help soon from the rotation as well from either Jose Butto or Joey Lucchesi, who both had strong starts to the season.
Gilbert,
especially Lucchesi.
Drew Gilbert and Luis Angel Acuna went back-to-back on opening day for Syracuse off of former Met Robert Gazelman, which was quite a thing to see him back in baseball. So good for Gazelman. And I think through 3 games, I think Acuna had 1 more hit, and I think that's Gilbert's only hit so far. So they haven't exactly raked through the first 3 games, but I think those guys are going to hit at the AAA level, and it's something that we'll be assessing their value to the big league team, here in probably the next month or 2. On the pitching side, this is where it's going to get really unique to fill McGill's spot. The plan right now is they shouldn't need someone to fill his spot in the rotation until April 12th is the date that Steve Gelb said on Mets pregame show on Monday. And the complication involving that is, based on MLB rules, the only way the Mets can recall either Butto or Lucchesi for that spot is if someone goes on the IL. So if no one else gets hurt, neither of those guys will be eligible yet to take that spot in the rotation, which means it's going to have to be someone not on the roster, which Andy Martino of SNY has reported that the Mets have had renewed conversations with Julio Teheran, who they tried to sign, in the middle of spring training, and he chose Baltimore. So maybe that is something that bears watching. Otherwise, it's going to have to be a different non-roster player. And he didn't have a good first start. Mike Vassell struggled in his first start for Syracuse, but he is the guy that exactly lines up to pitch that day if the Mets wanted to. Or they could obviously dip into a Dom Hamill or Christian Scott, who have yet to start as of this recording yet for Syracuse. But on the 12th, unless somebody else gets injured on the Mets, it's going to be somebody that is currently not on the 40-man roster taking that start.
All right. So we'll keep an eye on that scenario for the Mets. Obviously, it's typical this time of year, all arms on deck. The Mets are going to be going through a lot of different arms, especially they come into the season without Senga, McGill, durability questions once again. And like you said, Joe, you have Budo and Lucchesi, who we know are going to pitch for this team at some point, but a little bit more interesting what the Mets will have to do from there. All right, let's bring back the scoreboard from last year. If you're new to the Mets pod or you need a refresher, as you see, if you're watching on YouTube, that is Joe holding up the trophy. He is the reigning champion of the scoreboard. This is chapter 2. Last year, Joe won. Joe and I, every single week, just about, on the Mets pod throughout the season, do over-unders predicting the next week of games. So we will kick this off, of course, weather permitting this week. Predictions for the next 6 games. Joe, you are the champion. I'm going to give you the floor for the first one here. Over, under, push. The number is set at 2 for how many home runs Pete Alonso will hit in the next 6 games. 2 against the Tigers, 3 against the Reds, 1 against the Braves.
I was thinking about going under, but I'm going to push. And the reason I'm going to push is because they are at Cincinnati. And that is one of the most notorious hitter ballparks. So Alonso doesn't really have to get into one to get it out of there in Cincinnati. So I'll push and say 2.
I'm going to agree with you on this one. I was leaning the under, but you're right about the ballpark. And, I think, once again, Pete's just going to hit a lot of home runs this year. So as much as when you have that kind of hitter's park, he typically performs, it feels like, somewhat well against the Braves. I know it's only 1 game on this slate, but I'll go with 2 home runs for Pete as well. Over under push is set at 1 for how many home runs Francisco Alvarez will hit in the next 6 games. I'm going to push on this one as well, Joe. Alvarez obviously is going to need some days off at some point. I know they're trying to get him in the DH spot when JD Martinez is not here yet. That's going to change as soon as Martinez gets up. Alvarez will get more days off. So across 6 games, I have 1 home run for Alvarez.
I'll go under. I'll say he's not going to homer in the next few days, but man, is he putting up good at bats? And he's one of the few in this lineup that he is working counts. He's seeing pitches. His eye looks a lot better in the early going than it did, throughout his up and down 2023. But I'll say you mix in a day off or 2 and no home runs for Alvarez in the next 6.
Over under push is set at 5 for how many innings Adrian Hauser will make in his first start, Joe.
Feels like the push of the century, right? Does it? I think Adrian Hauser is just going to be a 5-inning type of guy, I think, most of this year. So I will say 5 innings for Adrian Hauser feels like the perfectly right number.
I know the Mets want to be delicate with these guys coming out of the gate, but I will take the over for Hauser. I'm not saying he's going to get a quality start, but I think they'll try to push him into the 5th inning if he can get an out or 2 there. So I'll go with the over for Hauser. Over under push is set at 3 for how many errors the Mets will make in the next 6 games. Man, it hasn't looked pretty in the field at times yet, but I think they're going to settle in, Joe. I'm going to go with the under here. I'm thinking 2 errors for the Mets across the next 6.
I'm going to go under 2. I can't say how many mental errors are going to make, but we're not accounting for mental errors. We're accounting for physical errors on the scoreboard, which, see, I didn't even say scorecard that time, but I was close. But I'll go under 3 errors because I do think while you've had, Joey Wendell boot a ball, Zach Short boot a ball, I think it will be largely a good defensive team, and I'll say under on the errors.
And the short play was not an error on the official scorecard.
That was an error.
Well, if you have Luis Severino in fantasy, it didn't help you. So that's why. So I'm saying that. Over under push is set at 3 for how many wins for the Mets in the next 6 games, Joe? Good luck.
Oof. I'm a glass half full guy.
You're gonna push, aren't you?
No. I'm gonna say over. I think we're rolling. The Mets have to. They're not currently rolling, but they're going to be rolling.
Okay.
They have to bounce out of this. I don't think we're looking at a 1-9 start or a 2-9 start or whatever.
Schedule's not great.
I mean, you play who you play, but
Right.
screw it. I'm going to be positive. I'm going over. They're going to win 4 of the next 6.
I'm going to take the under. I think the Mets go 2-4 in the next 6 games here, which would not be great. The Mets need to start playing some baseball closer to 500 baseball, but I hope this is one, Joe, that you beat me on. Absolutely. Let's jump into the mailbag. Got a great question here on YouTube from last week from Alan Taylor 6939. Hi guys, by the time you read this and react to this, the Mets will already have played a few games. Please answer the following questions if the games go well. Which Met is most likely to win MVP? Which seats should I book for the World Series? Should Steve Cohen be inducted in the Hall of Fame? If the games go poorly, please instead answer these questions. So I will toss these to you, Joe, and I'll take them as well. Why hasn't the team traded Pete Alonso for prospects yet? How much longer till Mendoza gets fired? Should we march on Citi Field and demand Steve Cohen sell the team? Love the show. Let's go Mets, unless they're bad. Just
that is the
a perfect
definition.
encapsulation of the Mets fandom.
100%. I mean, that is exactly that's exactly how Mets fans will operate. You get those short winning streaks, and now we're heading towards the promised land. You have these short losing streaks, and the season is over. So obviously, within the confines of those questions, which I'm largely taking obviously in jest, I think when we look ahead a few months from now, if the Mets haven't turned around, we're going to be having quite the conversation regarding Pete Alonso and a trade market for him. But yeah, that one definitely made me laugh.
It was really funny. Well done. We'll revisit it depending how the team plays next week. So let's jump into some Twitter mailbag questions. This one from @Dad of 2 Pugs. Does Jett Williams need to be in Queens ASAP? The Mets don't have a manufacturer runs guy in the lineup. I think, Joe, this is one of those ones where you start with the latter to answer the former. The Mets, it seems like, one, Nimmo, let's not just write off Brandon Nimmo as a manufacturer runs guy. I mean, Nimmo's going to work his walks, get on base. I stand by the fact that it's frustrating he's not a stolen base threat at the top of the lineup. Let's let Jett season a little bit, right? I think if Luis Angel Acuna has a good, 2 months here in Syracuse, you call him up and you play him at the bottom of the lineup and let him grow into that opportunity, which we don't even project Acuna like that, so it's weird to say that. But I think, Joe, you don't want to rush the best prospect in the Mets' pretty dang good farm system in Jett Williams to kind of try to fix a now problem that has, it's not the kid's fault, right? It just seems like a bad... I get it from the Met fan perspective, but I think Jett should be allowed to grow in the minors. And if he's does what he did last year, where every single level of baseball is not big enough for the kid, then sure, who cares? Just get him up here like some teams have done. But we also, having this conversation the first week of April, doesn't really seem fair to him or the organization right now.
It's like that meme where that guy slaps tape on the big tank of water just trying to stop it from flooding. But yep. Jett Williams, here's the thing. He has less than a week or about a week of AA experience, and the AA season hasn't even started yet. So no, Jett Williams ASAP is not a thing. But if Jett Williams, to your point, Connor, forces the Mets' hand as we progress through this summer, he has openly said his goals to make the majors this year, and I'm certainly not going to be the guy that says he cannot accomplish that. And when you look at what your prototypical ideal type of leadoff hitter is, Jett Williams' skill set, at least on the surface, kind of encapsulates exactly what you and probably most fans are hoping for from a leadoff hitter. Just let him grow, let him get there. He needs more experience in the upper minors before we start talking about him at the major leagues.
Right. That's fair. And we'll be all over this. We're not going to just ignore Jett Williams. If he performs, then the calls get louder. Then the conversation will be brought up because he has the best chance of all these guys to actually bat in the top 2 of the order, where I think, Gilbert and Acuna, Joe, we're not setting that kind of expectation, especially early in their young careers. All right, the last one here from Matty Rolls. Rank these 3 players on the likelihood of being traded. Vientos, McNeil, and Alonso. Also, which of the next group of kids gets the call first? Acuna, Gilbert, Scott, or Hamill?
Okay, so
McNeil's the almost no-brainer answer. to me.
So most likely to get traded, I think I go the order he has it. I think.
Okay, so you think Vientos?
I think Vientos most likely. Obviously, we saw what happened when he kind of liked that thing on Instagram and then
It's
unliked
not
it on
great, by the
Instagram.
way.
Yeah, not great optics. Maybe it was an accidental like. I can't rule out that possibility. But yeah, it's not great when one of your players who we know was angry that he didn't make the roster likes something on Instagram about the Brewers hitting a home run against the Mets. So not the best look. And I'm sure he was told by somebody, please go ahead and take that like away because everyone's talking about it.
Right.
But he feels like at this point, and we talked about it on last week's show or the week before, he feels like a guy that his time with the Mets is probably limited. He might get opportunity here this year, but it feels like a try to build up trade value type of situation, because now this is two front offices and coaching staffs that didn't want to give this guy an opportunity. Next, Jeff McNeil. I'll say obviously the start has not been ideal, but if he could get into hitting, and you look at as we progress forward, the Acunas, the Jett Williams, those are guys that project that could play his position of second base. So I think that is a factor. And Alonso, I'm just going to hold out hope that this season is not going to go to crap. And if the season doesn't go to complete crap, then Pete Alonso is going to spend the whole season with the Mets.
That's where I land on this, is that the decision to trade Pete would have ramifications I don't think the Mets are comfortable with, right? And let's be honest, Pete's a full-blown rental at the deadline. So if you think you're getting this Juan Soto return for Pete Alonso when he was traded to the Padres, it's not even close to that. No. It's not even close. So, I mean, and it's not like Scherzer and Verlander, where one, starting pitching is at a premium at the deadline, unlike anything we've ever seen. Two, the Mets got legit returns for those guys because of the money they were willing to pay the following year, where those teams are getting insane discounts for higher end starting pitching. So I think when that comes into play, that enhanced the value in ways that were a little harder to predict, where I'll just forewarn people, if the Mets are going poorly enough at the deadline where a lot of names are available, I think the rumored returns for Alonso would really, really underwhelm, where you have to ask yourself, are we going to potentially fracture this relationship, or let him go find somewhere that he might really like, that will make our free agency pursuit of Pete, who the Mets want back, and Scott Boras will take Pete Alonso to free agency? Do we want to open that door? Obviously, it's so early that everybody sitting here is going, it's too early to talk about that. It's going to be too early to talk about that for me for a really long time. And maybe things change, but Joe, it would have to be a totally different universe for me for the Mets to go there, where I don't feel that way with McNeil at all. Honestly, I think if McNeil is having an average season and the Mets are out of it at the deadline, I think one, they might be interested in paying again for any kind of return. And two, it opens up the door for the young guys we constantly talk about on the show in the middle infield. And that's not even factoring that. Let's not pretend Ronnie Mauricio doesn't exist anymore. Yes, he's out for the year, but Ronnie Mauricio is a big part of this team's future. And there's a legit chance that big part is at second base, more so than anywhere else. So Vientos is my 50-50 guy. And I was not surprised that you have him at the top, because you felt this way for a while. And the Mets have not shown any interest in making him a part of their franchise. But I mean, the bottom line is, with Vientos, he has no value right now. The most value he has is to the Mets, as we have no faith right now, unfortunately, in DJ Stewart. We know that Vientos is a different player in terms of the matchups you want him getting. But JD Martinez is a guy that also, as great as he has been last year, has dealt with health issues over the last 3 years, that Vientos' value might be the highest to the Mets when you compare it to the lack of return. So it's a tricky one. For me, though, I rank it McNeil, Vientos, and then Pete. We have a lot left to go. Joe, I don't always get to do this because our shows have been really jammed during the winter, ironically, but it's a good time for this. Closing thoughts after the first half week of the regular season.
Before closing thoughts, there was a second half to that question about prospects. Can you list those again? I don't want to shortchange our listener that asked the prospect question.
This can be your closing thoughts. Which of the next group of kids gets the first call? Acuna, Gilbert, Scott, or Hamill. And I think, Joe, you kind of teased at this when you brought up the pitchers earlier.
Yeah, I think a pitcher is, probably going to beat either Gilbert or Acuna to the big leagues, and that might be for a start and then going back kind of thing. It may not be a permanent fixture, but it could be, because as Keith Hernandez said on the broadcast on Monday night, sometimes you get one opportunity and you got to run with it. So if a Scott, right, exactly, like that's the prime example. But if a Christian Scott or a Dom Hamill or a Mike Vassell gets the call to go make a spot start, you have the opportunity to take that rotation spot if you go and perform. So I would lean pitchers where the Mets are at currently. Otherwise, closing thoughts, let's try to take a breath. I understand why everyone's frustrated, and I'm not here to tell anyone that they shouldn't be frustrated. The Mets have now played 2.4% of their season, which means my math is okay. What's that? 97.6% of the season remaining. So let's not, go jumping and going completely out of control. Let's realize that this team does still have good talent. It's flawed we're talking, when we were doing our projections, we were looking at, maybe a mid-80s type of record. So it's not like we were talking about a 100-win team that's off to this drastically horrible start. But it's only 4 games. Try to relax. We can look back. There was a Mickey Callaway-led Mets team that started 11-1, and we know that certainly did not work out. And the Mets were, I think, 14-7 to start last year, which obviously that went sideways. So it's 4 games. Try to breathe. There's a whole mess of baseball, and we're going to be here every single week to talk about it for the next 6 months, to talk about real baseball. So if we're calling the season now, it's not going to be the best Mets pods for the next 6 months. So let's try to get there, and they just need to I think they need 1 win. If they get 1 win, they need to get that 1 win just off their back, give them a chance to breathe, not just the fans. And then I think maybe things could start trending in the direction that we are hoping it can.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today, and remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag. And, of course, you can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel. Become a subscriber over there as well. Thanks so much, everybody. Better times ahead. We'll catch you next week.